logged in. So I see a few people have logged in. Good evening and welcome to this web for the Kumeyaay Corridor Comprehensive Multimodal Corridor. My name is Jessica Cisco and I'll be serving as the moderator of tonight's meeting. We're going to wait a few minutes to get started. As we're waiting for people to get logged in, if you'd like, you could go ahead and put your name and/or any organization or affiliation in the chat. This is entirely optional, but I could read people's names out and welcome them in the chat as they start to join. We will give it a few minutes, though, to give people a chance to get logged in. Carrie Forrest from Descanso Community Planning Group, welcome. Okay, I see a few more people have logged in. Thank you for joining us for this webinar for the Kumeyaay Corridor Comprehensive Multimodal Corridor Plan. My name is Jessica Cisco, serving as the moderator of tonight's meeting. If you'd like, while we're waiting for people to get logged in, you could enter your name and any organization or affiliation in the chat, and I'll welcome you to the meeting. This is entirely optional. Looks like we also have Veronica Coleman, Caltrans headquarters. Welcome. Okay, I'm going to repeat our welcome information one more time, and then I'll ask our Spanish interpreter, Carlos Diaz, to repeat it. So thank you for joining us. We are waiting a few minutes to get started to give people a chance to get logged in. In the meantime, if you'd like, you can enter your name and any organization or affiliation in the chat, and I will welcome you to the meeting. Carlos, could you repeat this information in Spanish, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos, bienvenidas a este seminario web sobre el plan integral de corredor multimodal para el corredor Kumeyaay. Estamos dando un par de minutos para que ingresen más personas. Mientras tanto, les invitamos a autopresentarse en la ventana de chat indicando su nombre y alguna organización a la que pertenezcan. De esa forma les podemos saludar en el chat. Gracias.
Thank you, Carlos. And we'll go through the interpretation instructions on the next slide once we start the meeting.
Y una vez que inicie la sesión, presentaremos a ustedes instrucciones para la interpretación al español. Gracias.
Okay. I'll just give it maybe about one more minute. So thank you for joining us. We're just waiting a few minutes to let people get logged in. In the meantime, if you want to drop your name and any organization or affiliation in the chat, I'll welcome you to the meeting.
Buenas tardes. Nuevamente estamos dando un par de minutos a que ingresen más personas antes de iniciar. Mientras tanto, les invitamos a autopresentarse en el chat, indicando su nombre y una organización a la que pertenezca en su caso. Así le podemos dar la bienvenida a partir de su presentación en el chat. Gracias.
Thank you, Carlos. Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We are so excited to share this draft corridor plan with you all. I want to highlight that this project was named Kumeyaay Corridor in honor of being located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Kumeyaay people. Carlos, if you could repeat this, then we'll move on to the interpretation instructions.
Muy buenas tardes. Nos entusiasma que nos acompañen para presentar este borrador del Plan Integral de Corredor Multimodal para el Corredor Kumeyaay, cuyo nombre se le otorgó en honor a la tierra indígena ancestral tradicional sobre la que ocurre este corredor.
Thank you, Carlos. Okay, so good evening and welcome to this webinar for the Kumeyaay Corridor Comprehensive Multimodal Corridor Plan. Our meeting tonight will be broadcast in English with simultaneous Spanish interpretation. Carlos Diaz will be serving as our Spanish interpreter. In a few moments, we'll activate the interpretation and you will be able to click on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen to select the language you would like to hear the presentation in. You won't see that globe icon until we activate it here in just a moment. We're going to go through the instructions in English and Spanish, and then we'll activate that globe icon for you. We'll need everyone to select a language using the interpretation button, even those that are participating in the meeting in English. And this is so that it will allow everyone to hear the interpretation for any questions that we may receive in Spanish. At this time, I'd like to welcome Carlos and invite him to repeat these instructions in Spanish.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Buenas tardes. Una vez más, bienvenidos, bienvenidas a este seminario web sobre el Plan Integral de Corredor Multimodal para el Corredor Kumeyaay. Se está ofreciendo interpretación simultánea para esta sesión. Justo después de este aviso, en la barra de controles de Zoom les va a aparecer un icono de interpretación, parece un globo terráqueo. Simplemente le da clic y selecciona Spanish o español. Si nos acompaña desde una aplicación móvil, es decir, en celular, tableta, etcétera, con la aplicación de Zoom, posiblemente no ve el icono, en cuyo caso presionaría los puntos suspensivos, luego interpretación y después su idioma. Gracias and thank you.
Great, thank you. So we'll go ahead and enable the interpretation feature. And again, everyone should select a language so that you can hear interpretation back and forth as needed. I'm going to select English myself right now so I can hear the interpretation. And we'll give you a moment to select your language. I'd also like to note that if you would like to follow the presentation in Spanish, a link to download the Spanish PowerPoint is available in the chat box. Okay. I'd now like to introduce Melina Pereira, Senior Transportation Planner with Caltrans, and April De Jesus, Senior Transportation Planner at SANDAG.
Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone. We will go ahead and get started. Caltrans and SANDAG are committed to Title VI and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and have created language assistance programs for anyone needing interpretation and translation. We will now move on to the agenda. So this corridor plan is a partnership between Caltrans and SANDAG and encourages regional collaboration. This slide provides a list of the topics that we will cover during this evening's presentation. We will go through an overview of the Comprehensive Multimodal Corridor Plan, or CMCPs or corridor plans, the Kumeyaay Corridor CMCP, community engagement efforts, transportation solution strategy highlights with survey opportunities for your feedback, an opportunity to ask questions with the project team during our Q&A session, and then we will close with sharing where to review the corridor plan and share additional thoughts. So CMCPs or corridor plans are data-driven plans intended to increase transportation options, reduce vehicle miles traveled, and greenhouse gas emissions. The plans propose solutions to build more efficient transportation networks, support climate change initiatives, and improve access for residents, commuters, visitors, and goods movement. Overall, corridor plans allow us to be more competitive for grant funding, such as Senate Bill 1, Solutions for Congested Corridors program. The Kumeyaay Corridor is the 6th corridor plan in the San Diego region. The Kumeyaay Corridor Plan Study area encompasses an approximate 2-mile buffer of the Interstate 8 between the bay and lakeside, a length approximately 24 miles. An area of influence was also established with the intent of expanding engagement efforts to include the community of Alpine and the tribal communities of the Kumeyaay Nation. Another component of this effort is the Mission Valley Mobility Study, which was funded by the Caltrans Sustainable Transportation Planning Grant Program. So in partnership with MTS and the City of San Diego, this study identified and prioritized near-term mobility needs with a focus on transportation services and access options that decrease congestion and improve travel times for all transportation modes. Understanding travel patterns is vital to providing a transportation network that fulfills the user's needs. Approximately 3.5 million trips start and/or end within the Kumeyaay Corridor study area every day, which represents over 30% of all trips in the region. And of those 3.5 million daily trips, approximately 6% are by people walking, 1% on bicycles, and the remaining 93% in vehicles, which include single occupancy cars, carpooling, rideshare, and public transportation. So it's important to note that over 1/3 of the 3.5 million trips are for distances less than 2.5 miles. So with the appropriate infrastructure and technology, many of these trips can easily be converted into active transportation or short transit trips. Community engagement has included a virtual engagement hub with an interactive map and survey, presentations to community planning groups, an agency coordination team, briefings for SANDAG committees, updates for community-based organizations, a public meeting, and booths at community events. The draft corridor plan reflects public input that was collected between August 9th of 2022 and March 3rd of 2023 during phase 1 of community engagement. Some highlights of phase 1 community engagement in terms of participation include 686 map comments that we received, 519 survey responses. We made about 16 presentations to regional working groups, committees, to stakeholders, community-based organizations, and community planning groups. We had 1 virtual public workshop and 2 pop-up events. So this slide provides an overview of the roadmap to develop the final corridor plan. Over the past 2 years or so, we conducted research on existing conditions, engaged public input through meetings, community events, and coordination with community-based organizations, developed transportation solutions. The draft CMCP was released this month on March 6th. SANDAG and Caltrans will consider public input through April 5th, and then finalize the corridor plan so it is available as a reference for future funding considerations. The draft corridor plan includes the following chapters: an introduction, corridor context, community engagement, planning approach, transportation solution strategies, and the implementation. Additionally, there are also 7 appendices included to offer more comprehensive information in support of the development of this corridor plan. I will now pass it on to April.
Thank you, Melina. We are really excited to share the transportation solution strategy projects that are included in this corridor plan. We have hundreds of these transportation solutions, and all of these projects build off of recently updated planning studies. So these are the projects that have already been developed with communities along this corridor. And these projects are listed in Appendix E of the corridor plan. So if you want to see a specific mode in more detail, or if you want to follow along and go through the appendix, these projects are listed in Appendix E. So we are including active transportation projects, which provide safe and comfortable bike and pedestrian facilities. Examples of these may include physical separation from cars, traffic calming, and enhanced street crossings. We also are recommending some transit projects, which include the Purple Line, which connects San Isidro and Sereno Mesa, as well as several rapid bus routes, which are supported by improvements like dedicated bus lanes and operational improvements to improve some travel times for our services. And mobility hubs help improve connections to and from transit by connecting other types of travel like our flexible fleets. Flexible fleets include shared bikes and scooters, microtransit, and other services that help increase alternatives to driving alone. Highway, roadway, and goods movement recommendations include managed lanes and interchange treatments to improve operations and safety for all travel modes. We also have the NextOS, which is a strategy in the regional plan that compiles transportation information into a data hub. And this allows us to make more informed decisions and also monitor and adjust conditions in real time to help us optimize our transportation and safety. And climate resilience strategies are really important for all of our transportation investments. And recommendations include shade structures, cool pavements, vegetation management, stormwater infrastructure, and flood sensors. Any projects that you don't see in Appendix E can be considered in the next corridor plan update and would be included in an appendix of this corridor plan. So I'm encouraging everyone here to share your thoughts in the comment section of our project page. And now I'm going to step through some examples for each of these project modes. So we really appreciate the feedback we received from the community, and we saw a few themes related to active transportation. We learned that there is significant interest in pedestrian and bike infrastructure improvements. Community members also shared that they have a desire to have physical separation from vehicle traffic. And additionally, several of you noted that there's an importance of pedestrian-only infrastructure to increase connectivity and safety in our corridor area. We took your feedback and proposed a network of separated bike lane facilities, such as cycle tracks and multi-use paths. Separated facilities increase user and safety and comfort by creating physical separation between active transportation users and cars. These facilities are commonly recommended along roadways with higher posted speed limits and/or traffic volumes. Other examples of active transportation improvements include enhanced intersection crossings and traffic calmed roadways or bike lanes on streets with lower speeds and traffic volumes. So this map highlights the existing bike facilities with the thin lines, and we tried to highlight our proposed improvements with the thicker lines so you can visibly see the overall network improvements. There are 4 types of bike facilities in the California Highway Design Manual. Our goal is to address the concerns about connectivity and safety that we heard from the community. And we started by looking at our existing network, and then we added some of the proposed improvements from the recently adopted plans. And then we tried to fill some of the gaps for connectivity or identify opportunities for a better bike facility than the standard class 2 bike lanes, which is the striping that you see on the roadway, or the shared class 3 bike routes, which is where bikes have to share their lane with vehicles. Class 1 bike paths, class 4 cycle tracks, and bike boulevards have enhanced safety separation for better protection and delineates the bike's travel area from the vehicle's travel area. And bike lanes are shared right-of-way for buses and bikes. And this larger road section for the bikes is only shared with trained bus drivers, so it adds increased safety for a bicyclist. There was a gap. Some examples of the improvements we're including on this map show that there was a gap in pedestrian and bike connectivity around 70th Street Transit Station. This is near San Diego State University. So we recommended a class 1 pedestrian and bicycle bridge from Parkway Drive to Alvarado Road. And then along University Avenue to College Grove, the existing facilities alternate between class 2, which is this traditional striping that you usually see, or class 3, which is a shared bike facility with our road. And we made recommendations for an upgrade to a class 4 cycle track improvement. The west side of San Diego, the west side from San Diego River Trail to West Point Loma Boulevard, there's an existing buffered bike lane, and we'd like to see that upgraded into a Class 4 cycle track. We have a total of 281 active transportation recommendations in our corridor plan, and these active transportation solutions encompass several miles of protected bikeways with over 37 miles of Class 1 bike paths, 139 miles of Class 4 cycle tracks, 5 miles of bus-bike shared lanes, and 17 miles of bike boulevard. This leaves about 45 miles of Class 2 bike lanes and 22 miles of Class 3 bike routes to help fill the gaps in our bike network. Now I'm going to pass it to Jessica to hear from you.
Thank you, April. So throughout tonight's presentation, we'll be conducting some Zoom polls to get your input. Our first question is seeking your feedback on proposed active transportation changes that you just heard about from April. So the question is, would these changes help make the community feel more comfortable walking, biking, and rolling to get around? We're asking that you please select an answer between 1 and 5, where 5 would indicate the changes help a lot, and 1 would indicate they do not help. You can also select I need more time to review if you'd like to take a closer look at the draft corridor plan on the project website and provide your feedback via the comment form available there. So I'll give you a few moments to answer, and then we'll take a look at the poll results. Okay, I still see some answers coming in, so we'll give it a little bit more time. Okay, maybe we'll give it another 30 seconds or so if anyone else would like to weigh in, and then we'll review the poll results. And I'd like to remind you too, if you have questions about any of the material that's presented tonight or questions about the corridor plan itself, you can submit those questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll review them when we get to the question and answer session. Okay, I'm not seeing any more responses come in. So let's take a look at the input that we got here. So it looks like opinions were pretty mixed. I guess first of all, let's see. It looks like several people indicated need more time to, or I shouldn't say several people. There were a few people that indicated I need more time to review. And then some folks indicated moderately helps, or maybe a little bit more than that. And then there was also some that weighed in at 1 does not help and 5 helps a lot. So pretty mixed opinions on this one. And if there are questions regarding the active transportation solutions that April reviewed, we can answer those during the question and answer session. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to April.
Thank you, Jessica. So transit connectivity and reliability is really important if we want to encourage alternatives to driving alone. And we identified transit, mobility hubs, and flex fleets projects that addressed key themes that emerged from the feedback we received from you. We heard that there's a desire for increasing frequency and enhancing our travel times for existing transit services, while also providing better access. We also heard that there's significant interest in expanded coverage for bus and rail transit in the corridor area to support our trolley, coaster, and Amtrak services. Our recommendations provide higher frequency rapid services, and these rapid services have complementing infrastructure improvements to enhance reliability, such as bus-only roadway striping and transit priority signals. These service enhancements create additional network connections amongst La Mesa, Ocean Beach, Point Loma, Kearney Mesa, Spring Valley, Claremont, Chula Vista, San Diego State University, and all throughout our region. Mobility hubs provide a solution to facilitate access between transit and other modes, and mobility hub features may include enhanced waiting areas, wider sidewalks, bike racks, information kiosks, and shared bikes and scooters. A new exciting project is the Skyway that is proposed between Mission Valley and Hillcrest, and as it was recommended in the Mission Valley Community Plan Update, and the picture is here on the slide. And this is a service that we're used to only seeing at amusement parks, but it's actually an innovative and effective travel mode in areas with steep and challenging topography. This Skyway will improve access between major employment centers, commercial areas, and the Green Line trolley. Transit, mobility, and flexible fleet solutions are shown on this map. I mentioned earlier about the Skyway, and the improvement is shown here in the orange line with the white dots. And this is an important connection between Mission Valley and several medical facilities up in Hillcrest. If you look at the dark purple, it includes additional tracks to enhance our existing trolley network with opportunities to increase frequency or provide express services. A new trolley station, which is at this pink circle with the letter T, will serve the new Riverwalk development, and just east of that, you'll see a purple circle, which is a direct access ramp to help facilitate efficient transit services crossing Interstate 8 at State Route 163 and Interstate 15. In the dark blue, you'll see a new high-speed rail project, also known as the Purple Line, and it's currently underway, so several of you will continue to hear about it. And in the bright green on the west side, you'll see a new trolley alignment connecting the Port Transit Center to Ocean Beach. And throughout the corridor plan, we also have several rapid bus routes, which you'll see identified in blue on this map. These pink blobs are the mobility hubs, and these mobility hubs complement the transit system by facilitating connections and various other modes of travel. Flexible fleets are a variety of services to enhance transit access and connections with these mobility hubs. In our project list, there's 42 transit, mobility hubs, and flex fleet solutions that are part of our corridor plan. And I'm going to pass it back to Jessica to hear what you think about these transit improvements.
Thank you, April. So our second question is seeking your feedback on proposed transit changes that April just described. And the question is, would these changes help make it easier for the community to get around while using transit? And we're asking you to use the same scale of 1 to 5. So 5 would indicate the changes help a lot, and 1 would indicate they do not help. You can also select, I need more time to review, if you'd like to take a closer look at the draft corridor plan on the project website and provide your feedback later. And I see some questions coming in, so we'll keep track of those and cover them when we get to the question and answer session. Thank you for submitting those. Okay. I see some answers coming in. We'll give you some more time. Okay, we'll give it maybe another 30 seconds or so, see if anyone else would like to weigh in, and then we'll take a look at the results. Okay, I'm not seeing any additional feedback coming in, so we'll go ahead and review the results now. It looks like quite a few people indicated 5 helps a lot, and then we've got a pretty even split across 2, 3, and 4, with some additional participants noting that they need more time to review. So thank you for that feedback, and we're going to move on to the next topic.
So congestion is a key issue that consistently emerged when we met with the community, and this relates to our highway, roads, and goods movement infrastructure. We heard concerns about missing shoulder lanes and short on-ramps, We also heard that improvements to congestion is really important as we look at some of these multimodal solutions. So to address these issues, flex lanes are proposed along multi-lane roadways to increase roadway efficiency during normal operations and special events. These flex lanes utilize technology to designate lanes for preferred uses in response to dynamic traffic conditions. Additionally, they can be dedicated for transit, high occupancy vehicles, autonomous or connected vehicles, emergency access, or to streamline goods movement. In our analysis, the flex lane improvements are identified as managed lanes on Interstate 8. Roundabouts are also recommended to reduce congestion by maximizing operational efficiency and also improving safety for all travel modes. The rendering seen in this photo is a concept on a bridge deck above Interstate 8 to limit the number of pedestrians crossing the freeway on and off ramps. Additionally, the proposed enhancements at freeway ramps include perpendicular roadway connections to on and off ramps, and this encourages drivers to slow down as they're making that sharp turn and help increase safety at these on and off ramps. And so in addition to the managed lanes that I discussed on the previous slide, there are new freeway-to-freeway connections that are proposed for some high occupancy vehicles, and you'll see these with blue dots on the map. And many of the older freeway ramp configurations on Interstate 8 pose challenges related to access, operations, and safety. The green dots identify interchange enhancements, which improve traffic flow to enhance pedestrian bike conditions around freeway on and off ramps. Examples of these recommendations include reconfiguration, realignment, diverging diamond interchange, roundabouts, direct access ramps, and other solutions. These recommendations better facilitate transitions and improve safety, reduce congestions, and provides protected bike and pedestrian facilities crossing the freeway. These infrastructure improvements are complemented by technology integration, which I'll talk about at the next slide. Our next operating system technology and infrastructure is a digital platform that compiles information from sources like passenger vehicles, buses, rideshare vehicles, delivery trucks, and other sources into a centralized hub. The data collected helps us better plan for data-centered decisions as it relates to transportation improvements and operational changes. One example is through changeable speed limits or lane assignments as shown in this picture. These features allow us to change the speed limit, or how a lane is used in real time as we're responding to either congestion or emergency events to support the flex lane concepts. Technology solutions may include extended fiber optic lines for better communication or transit signal priority, active parking management, and active traffic demand management. A total of 133 roadway technology solutions were analyzed in our study area, which will allow us to maximize impacts of our transportation investments. This next OS technology kind of just pulls everything together and makes the entire network more effective. Now I'm going to pass it back to Jessica to hear from you.
Thanks, April. So our third question is seeking your feedback on these roadway and technology improvements. The question is, would these roadway and technology improvements help people traveling by bus, car, or truck? And we're asking you to use the same rating scale between 1 and 5, where 5 indicates the changes help a lot and 1 indicates they do not help. And as with the other questions, you can select I need more time to review and provide your feedback at the project website. And I see a handful of questions have come in, so we're keeping track of those, and we can take a look at them when we get to the question and answer session here in a few minutes. Okay, I'll give it another 30 seconds or so to see if anyone else is going to weigh in on the poll. Okay, I don't see any additional feedback coming in, so we'll go ahead and take a look at the results. It looks like we had some folks indicate 3, 4, and 5. So on the end of the scale where it's providing more help with some additional participants following behind that indicating a 2, and then also I need more time to review. So thank you for that feedback. We're going to move into the final polling question, and that will be followed by the question and answer session. So our final poll question is seeking your feedback on which of the transportation solution strategies that we discussed this evening would best benefit the community. You can select all that apply. So on this one, you have the opportunity to select all that apply, and these align with the transportation solution strategy categories that April just reviewed with us. Okay. Let's see. All right, let's go ahead and share the results. So in terms of which strategies might best benefit the community, there's a lot of interest in transit, followed by highways, roads, and goods movement, and then active transportation, and finally, next OS, technology and infrastructure. So thank you. Appreciate all the feedback through the polls. We're going to move into the question and answer session now. So I'm going to provide an overview of how we'll run the question and answer session before we get started. So this session is intended to allow you to ask questions about today's presentation and about the draft corridor plan. If you have comments about the draft corridor plan, we're asking that you submit a comment through the comment form on the project website to ensure it gets captured there. And you have until April 5th to provide your comments via the project website. Let's go over a few administrative items in terms of participation in the question and answer session. So if you do have a question, we ask that you type it into the Q&A box in Zoom, and then I'll direct your questions to members of the project team. If you are unable to type your question or you are participating by phone, you can use the raise hand function, and I will call on you to ask your question verbally. For phone participants, you can raise your hand by entering *9 on your phone, and I will call on you by the last few digits of your phone number. I'd also like to note that we will try to answer as many questions as possible this evening. So we do ask that you limit your question to just about a minute or so that everyone has a chance to participate. And we've got the project managers that you've already met and the consultant team available this evening to answer your questions. If for some reason we aren't able to answer your question this evening, we'll post responses on the project website. And of course, we also ask that you use appropriate language and be civil in your questions. And finally, I do want to remind everyone that we have Spanish interpretation available. You can ask your question in Spanish, either in writing or verbally. And a reminder for anyone who might have joined late, if you'll want to click on the globe icon and select a language to participate in. That way you can hear information being interpreted back and forth in the event that we have any participants that are communicating in Spanish this evening. Okay, so with that overview, we're going to go ahead and move into the questions. So let's just take a look at what's come in. Okay. All right, so the first question I'm going to direct to Andrew Prescott from CR Associates. The question is, are the active transportation solutions completely consistent with the local jurisdiction's adopted general plan and active transportation plan, or are there cases where the active transportation solutions deviate from adopted plans?
Thank you. Yes, the adopted planning documents kind of started as the baseline for recommendation development for the active transportation components, as well as all of the other modes. And then from there, we took our existing conditions analysis, as well as input from the community members to help kind of refine those and look for additional opportunities for improvements. So it's a mix of adopted recommendations as well as some new improvements proposed here. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. I will direct the next question to Rachel Kennedy with SANDAG. The question is, it is my understanding that mobility hubs will now be referred to as transportation investment areas. Is that correct? And are the terms synonymous?
Yeah, so right now, in addition to the quarter plan, SANDAG is working on its next regional plan, which will be our 2025 regional plan. And we are looking to use that new term in that plan. Both mobility hubs and transportation investment areas are the same type of focus, the same type of area. It's basically an update in the nomenclature. And so we had started on this corridor plan before we started working on the terminology for the 2025 regional plan, but they are both the same type of area.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay. The next question I will direct to Monique Chen at CR Associates. And the question is, why doesn't the Uptown streetcar connect in a loop through Hillcrest or University Heights? It looks like two separate branches running through Bankers Hill and Golden Hill South Park.
Thank you, Jessica. In fact, that is a loop. I think what you saw on the map earlier was the blue color line was covering the pink line a little bit. In fact, it's a loop that connects Uptown to Hillcrest, to downtown, and to Golden Hill. And so if you look at Appendix E of the corridor plan, and on T7, TSS T7 is that project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Monique. I also wanted to note that if folks that are on the phone have questions, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Okay. So Monique, you stayed up. Thank you. I think I'm going to pass this next question to you as well. The question is, who is the quote community? What about those traveling into the community? What services are being discussed to reduce vehicle miles traveled from the rest of I-8 corridor from Jacumba to El Cajon?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. As part of the learning process, we did look at, the general region as a whole. We looked at, in fact, location-based origin to destination data, and to see, what areas are traveling to or through the I-8 corridor area. So that was in the foundation of our analysis. Well, that being said, the physical improvements are refined within the study area, which, you remember seeing it in Melina's description earlier, the dark blue area. However, our recommendations really we stop at the study boundary, but we did look at, increased bus frequencies and additional rapid bus routes in the East County. We believe that should help to reduce vehicle miles traveled. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. Okay. In a moment, Carlos, I might ask you to come over to the English room and just reiterate that participants can raise their hand to ask questions in Spanish if needed. We have a couple of other questions that came through. The next one looks like it's a question for April with SANDAG. The question is, was the starting point for the 456 CMCP solutions based on input from public outreach meetings, or was some type of existing conditions assessment performed in conjunction to identify locations in need of improvements?
Thank you, Jessica. So we understand that with every project study that we do, there's an extensive community outreach component, and we didn't want to start from scratch. We wanted to make sure that those efforts were also included as a baseline starting point before we started the corridor plan. And so we combed through several recently updated community plans within our project area, and those plans are listed in the appendix of the CMCP. And then we met with the community members to make sure that we understood the community needs and some of the challenges before we ultimately made some project recommendations that you see in the report. So it was a mix of all of those.
Thank you, April. And I see that we have some attendees on that are part of some of the community-based organizations that we met with over the past year or so. So appreciate that support and nice to see you all here at the meeting. I've got one more question for you, April. This plan excludes the East County residents from Jacumba to El Cajon. Is there potential for rapid transit to serve communities along the I-8 corridor?
So specifically for this CMCP, a lot of the recommendations are only within our project area corridor. However, we do have an area of influence, and we are collaborating with the regional plan efforts. And in the upcoming 2025 regional plan update, you should see that we're looking at microtransit in the East County, in El Cajon, and in Alpine.
Thanks, April. I'm going to pause for a moment. Carlos, I'm going to ask you if you could come over to the English channel and just reiterate that if needed, folks that are calling in on the phone can ask questions in Spanish, and they'll just press *9 to raise their hand. Okay. Let's see. So I just wanted to reiterate for si prefieren hacer las preguntas en español, pueden subir la mano por su teléfono por empujar estrella y 9. Si quieren hacer preguntas en español, si están en Zoom por su teléfono. Okay, just wanted to make sure we have a couple of people that called in, so just want to make sure everybody's aware of how to participate. Let's see. We've got one more question that came in. Melina Pereira from Caltrans, I'm going to direct this question to you. The question is, can you speak to the timeline for implementation of projects in Caltrans jurisdiction? In particular, I was interested in the Texas Street I-8 interchange redesign, which is much needed since it's very dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists traveling from North Park to Mission Valley or the Rio Vista trolley station. Caltrans has historically given little priority to complete streets projects, and I have almost been struck by cars multiple times while cycling through this area.
Well, thank you for the question. I will find out. I will get the answer to that specific project, which is the Texas Street I-8 interchange redesign. We have our project manager for that project, and I will be sure to get that information back over to you.
Thank you, Melina. Okay. I'm just double checking. I don't see any hands raised. Okay. Okay, we'll give it a few minutes here, see if more questions come to mind. In addition, if there is a slide you'd like us to revisit, we can move back in the slide deck if you'd like to take a closer look at any of the maps that we were reviewing. So we have a little bit of time here if anybody would like to take a closer look at something or has additional questions. Okay. Thanks for all your great questions so far. Okay, I see another question came in. Okay, Melina, this is along the same lines as a previous question you covered. So the question is, Camino de la Reina intersection at Texas Street is also problematic with pedestrians, which is jurisdiction of the city of San Diego. So I suppose that's more of a comment than a question, but I don't know if you want to address that at all, Melina.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, we will definitely note that down and talk to our team and make sure that we note that comment in the CMCP development.
Okay. Monique may want to have something to add on this one as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I was just going to add, if once we reconfigure the interchange at Texas Qualicum I-8, the congestion challenges at Camino de la Reina and Qualicum will alleviate itself, because a lot of the situation is because of the short weaving onto the on-ramps right now, and in addition to the traffic volumes. But we're confident if once we fix the interchange, we'll fix the intersection. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll sit tight here for a few minutes, see if there are any additional questions. Let's see. Okay, so got another question. It looks like this is a question for April. The question is, how will the 456 CMCP solutions be integrated into the 2025 regional plan and the associated $62.8 billion cost estimate?
So as part of these corridor plans, we are looking at several different investments, and some of those are regional projects, and some of those are more localized to the jurisdictions that they're located in. So a lot of these projects may not even be considered as part of a regional plan update just because the scale isn't big enough. And so that's one difference, but all of our CMCP recommendations are considered by the regional project team, the regional plan project team, to be considered as part of the unconstrained or constrained network.
Thank you, April. Let's see. I think we got a note from Nick Ortiz from that there may be some additional questions that Nick has. Nick, would you like us to get you unmuted so you can ask a question verbally? Let's go ahead and get you unmuted, see if you have another question. Should just take us a moment here. Okay, Nick, I think we'll work on getting you unmuted, or give you a moment to get yourself unmuted. In the meantime, I think we've got another question that came in that we can cover. Okay, so I think I'll direct this question to Steve Shabola from IBI, one of the consultant partners. The question is, will the Rapid 41 bus run from Hillcrest to UCSD or Fashion Valley to UCSD? Plans for that route have shown both as options. I would highly urge extending service to Hillcrest to provide a one-seat ride from Uptown to UTC.
So that decision hasn't been made yet. All of the rapids, beyond just being included in the corridor plan and the regional plan, will then each be subjected to, detailed study of routing, station locations before any decision is made. And I think both options are still valid and on the table. And there'll be, opportunities for engagement, from stakeholders on that study when it moves forward.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And it looks like a note came back from Nick that we've answered his 4 questions. Okay, so we don't need to get you unmuted. Great. Thanks for letting us know. Okay. We'll give it a few more minutes, and then I think what we'll do is move on to the conclusion slide, but we'll hang out here for a while after we conclude the meeting in case there are any additional questions that come up. Okay, so we do want to be respectful of everyone's time tonight. We don't see any more questions coming in, so would like to really thank you for your participation and your great questions during the Q&A, and we'll move to wrap up the formal portion of the presentation on the next slide, but we will stay on for a bit longer here in case there are other questions.
Thank you, Jessica. This corridor study was a partnership between SANDAG and Caltrans, and we had a lot of fun working with the local jurisdictions and the community to compile the recommendations in this plan. Melina and I are really excited to hear from all of you. We received a lot of comments so far, and we encourage you to visit the project webpage to review the report and provide your feedback. You can provide feedback to us until from now until April 5th at midnight. Just a reminder, if there is a project that you don't see on our Appendix E list, please add those to your comments, and we are going to be creating a new appendix with any projects that want to be considered for future corridor plan updates. We hope this session was informative and provides you with enough information for your review and feedback, and we thank you for attending our webinar.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Greatly appreciate all your feedback.
Like I said, we'll hang out here just a few more minutes in case any additional questions come up, but that concludes the formal portion of the webinar. So we'll sit tight here to see if anyone submits questions, but feel free to drop off as we do want to be respectful of your time. Thank you.